Good evening, everyone. Today we have two Parshiot this Shabbat, Parshiot Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. In the podcast, I have to get into the online video mode. In the shir that we had in Parshat Vayikra, I said that Vayikra is known in rabbinic literature as Torah. Does everyone hear me? Just, okay. So when we looked at Parshat Vayikra, I mentioned that Vayikra is known in rabbinic literature as Torat Kohanim, the Torah of the priests. And generally the way that's understood is because Vayikra is seen as the book that talks about the tabernacle, about sacrifices, about laws of ritual purity and impurity. But at the time I mentioned to you another way of understanding this, which is based on a verse from the book of Exodus in chapter 19, when the Jews are at Mount Sinai, where God says, "Vatem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So that in fact, the book of Vayikra is really concerned, how do we build a holy nation? And in that sense, our Parshiot are a dramatic turning point in the book. And what do I mean by that? The first 17 chapters, which includes the first 2 chapters of Parshat Acharei Mot, essentially deal with sacrifices, ritual purity and impurity. The one exception being chapter 11 in Vayikra, which deals with the laws, the essential laws of kashrut, which animals are kosher, which are not kosher. All of a sudden, in our Parshiot, as I said, we have a dramatic shift. And in chapter 18, which is the end of Parshat Acharei Mot, we speak about prohibited sexual relations. And in chapter 19, we have Parshat Kedoshim. And today what I would like to do is to essentially focus on Parshat Kedoshim, the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, and begin with a comment by Manatees. And hopefully we will manage this in terms of computer savvy. I would like to show you a source sheet on the screen. Okay, it worked. So what I want you to look at is, you see that I have over here the second verse of Parshat Kedoshim, where it says, Daber al kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'yamarta alehem kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem. Speak to the whole congregation of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy because I, Hashem, your God, am holy. So the question is raised, what does it mean to be holy? And I want to look at Nachmanides. The part which I skipped is where Nachmanides quotes Rashi's commentary. Rashi was the classic commentary on the Chumash. And Rashi says, what is Kedoshim Tiyu? So we'll see Rashi's commentary, how Nachmanides then kind of deflects it. So he says, in my opinion, the abstention referred to here is not to separate oneself from those who are sexually prohibited to him, as the rabbi Rashi said, which means that Rashi said, what does it mean to be holy? He quoted a rabbinic comment which says, Prushim to you, separate yourself. And Rashi said, separate yourself from arayot, from the prohibited sexual relations, which essentially is the section that came before this chapter, chapter 18. But the Ramban says, I don't agree with Rashi. And instead he says, rather it refers to the abstention, which is mentioned in numerous places in the Talmud, which confers upon those who master it the title Perushim. Okay, for those of you who are familiar with the term Pharisees, Pharisees essentially comes from the Hebrew word Prushim. And what Nachmanides is going to do now is define what does that word mean? Why are these people called Prushim? And how is that relevant to our Parsha? And he says the following. The explanation of the matter is as follows. Although the Torah has prohibited a whole range of sexual relationships and categories of foods, it nevertheless permits sexual relations with one's spouse and eating meat and wine. Hence, a person filled with desire can find an opportunity, and here I'll emphasize this, to be steeped in lewdness with his wife or many wives, to be among the drunkards from wine and the gluttons of meat, and to speak freely all types of vulgarity. For the Torah never prohibited any of these behaviors. And thus this person will be a scoundrel with the permission of the Torah. Therefore, Scripture, after listing specific prohibitions which are categorically prohibited, gives a general prohibition that we should abstain from excesses. One should minimize his sexual intimacy. One should sanctify himself by limiting his intake of wine. One should separate himself from ritual defilement. One should guard his mouth and tongue from self-pollution that is a result of overindulgence in eating and vulgar speech. Essentially, Scripture is adjuring us to be clean and pure and abstain from the masses of people who dirty themselves by excesses and ugly matters. So what I like to do is to spend a little bit of time on this Ramban and then start applying it to what we have in the Parsha. The Ramban disagrees with Rashi, and the Ramban says, in the Midrash, it says, Prushim to you, separate yourself. But it's not necessarily talking about separating yourself from the prohibited sexual relations. And essentially what the Ramban is saying is, we have many laws in the Torah which tell us what is forbidden, what is permitted. So what are we adding when we say, be holy? And essentially what the Ramban is saying is, to be holy means to set limits, to make borders, and specifically within the realm of that which is permitted to us. And the Ramban coins this very interesting phrase, which is a person has to know how to set the limits. Otherwise, they will be what he calls a scoundrel with the permission, the license of the Torah. I very often like to refer to this as what I call a glatt kosher pig. What is a glatt kosher pig? A glatt kosher pig is somebody who's very meticulous about eating food which is glatt kosher, but when he eats, he pigs out. And then the question is that really what the Torah wanted me to do? Is that what God wants me to do? Is it that God now said, you know what? You can eat meat. And once you eat meat, just go for it. You can have sexual relations with your wife within certain parameters, but once you do it 24/7. The Torah says there are certain types of speech which are prohibited. Gossiping, shaming. But what about telling off-color jokes? What about just talking all kinds of nonsense? That's where Kedoshim to you comes up. Kedoshim to you says, in that area, and in fact, I would even argue it's actually a pretty wide area where we're permitted to do many things. How do we set the limits? And here what I'd like to say, and here I'm adding to the Ramban. In the Pasuk it says, Kedoshim to you, be holy, because I, God, am holy. In effect, what it's saying is, God set the limits. When God gave us the Torah and said, this is permitted, this is prohibited. God is now saying to us, emulate me. How do you emulate God? Within the realm of what's permitted, now be like God and set the limits. But now I want to take it a step further. Essentially, Kedoshim to you is saying to us, it's not enough to just go by the letter of the law. It's extremely important to also understand and internalize the spirit of the law. And therefore, when we see the various laws, we have to ask ourselves, not just how am I going to fulfill this specific law, but what type of person are these laws trying to make me? And if I understand the spirit of the law, how do I then create a letter of the law, which is an extension of what God gave me? And I would now also add, because we generally understand things this way, to be holy essentially is to be transcendent. To be transcendent is to be like God. To be transcendent is to somehow go above and beyond my natural human tendencies. And then the question becomes, to what extent is it that I have somehow internalized God to the point where I'm able to actually transcend myself? And what I would like to just present right now is two things. First thing, this is something which is a lifetime engagement. It's not like we become holy and then we're there. We've now reached our plateau. Becoming holy is something that we, in fact, endeavor towards always. And now I want to say a second thing, which is especially relevant to our Parsha, which is that there are two types of holiness. There's one type of holiness, which is what we find in the beginning of the book of Vayikra. And to a great extent, that's the holiness of the priests. And in the realm of the priests, holiness is something which is very much orchestrated. The priests are given very, very careful rules and regulations as to how to operate. And essentially, that's what we have in the first 16, and I could add perhaps 17 chapters of Vayikra. Very, very detailed rules of how the priests operate in the temple with regard to sacrifices, ritual purity and impurity, the handbook of how they should be interacting with God.
Not to try to raise the bar.
Okay, I don't know who's actually speaking, but okay, I'll just keep on. If there are any questions or comments, so maybe we can save that after the shir. I forgot to mention that what we've been doing is after the shir, I spend about 20 minutes, half an hour with anybody who would like to remain afterwards. Raise any questions, comments, just schmooze if you'd like. So please save your questions or comments till afterwards, and I'll be happy to entertain them. So to get back to my trend of thought, the first 16, 17 chapters really have to do with the priests in the temple. It has to do with relating to God. It has to do with what we classically would understand as holiness. Holiness in terms of my interaction with God. But in fact, our parshiot present a whole different picture of what holiness is. And that has to do with the general Jewish population. After we see the holiness of the priests, we are now exposed to the holiness of the people. And the holiness of the people is reflected in their interpersonal relations. How do I relate to another person? I would even say it a little bit more sharply. Holiness is reflected in the mundane, the trivial, day-to-day interactions that we have. How careful are we regarding those interactions? How much do we really think, what would God want me to do in this given situation? And now I want to throw in something which I am a very firm believer of. It is much easier to deal with God than to deal with people. And that in fact, it's extremely challenging in our interaction with people to know what is the appropriate thing to do. And I would even add, very often in our interaction with people, there's a certain conflict of values. And how do we decide what to do? There's a gray area. And the last thing, which I'll just say as an introduction, is I don't think that there is a pat answer how you handle any given situation, because every situation is unique. And in any given situation, you have to really weigh all the different factors and then say to yourself, so what would God want me to do? So now let me give you the following. Let's look at a few things more specifically. And if you have a chumash, we'll start with that. In the very first verse, which follows, in chapter 19, verse 3, it says, Ish imo v'yaviv tira'u, ve'et shabtotai tishmoru, ani Adonai. One is supposed to be in awe of their parents. Okay, and by the way, I'll just mention this. We have another verse which appears in the Ten Commandments where it says that you should honor your parents. Being in awe of your parents is not the same thing as honoring your parents. The rabbis understand that honoring your parents is what you actually do actively. You feed them, you clothe them. Being in awe is what you refrain from. Which therefore means that I should be extremely careful that I don't do anything which is going to be offensive to my parents, which is going to hurt my parents. So the Gemara gives an actually very interesting example. What happens if my parents say to me, and my parents are not Shabbat observant, and I am, and my parents say to me, I would like you to pick up the phone which is ringing right now in our house. Could you turn off the stove? Or can you just drive to us on Shabbat? Or what if your parents say to you, we'd like to have you over for dinner. We're serving lobster. And then you come along and say, but I keep kosher. You don't care about your parents. You don't honor, respect your parents. You are insulting us. You won't eat in our house. So what do? What takes priority? Do I keep kosher, or do I respect my parents and eat in their non-kosher house? Now, the rabbis give a kind of blanket answer based on our verse. They said that the Torah purposely juxtaposed being in awe of your parents with observing Shabbat as a way of saying that where there's a conflict between the two, observance of Shabbat takes precedence over listening to your parents. And why? Because the end of the verse says, Ani Hashem, I am God. All of you are obligated to honor me. Now, I know for a whole bunch of people, they have a hard time with this. Because if it's a question of Shabbat and my parents, what question is this? In other words, of course, honoring my parents should be more important than Shabbat. So when I have people who tell me that, so I generally say to them, and what if your parents said to you, I'd like you to help us, cheat on our income tax. Okay, because we don't want to pay income tax, and you're an accountant, and I want you to find out all kinds of ways that we can somehow get around the government, or that's already maybe slightly kosher because you can find legal loopholes. But what if they tell you, I want you to actually cheat? So do you say you honor your parents in that situation? What if your parents said, I'd like you to kill somebody. They ruined my life. Or I'd like you to do something short of killing them. Right? Make their lives miserable. How about that? Should I listen to my parents then? Or how about if your parents say, you know what? I have the perfect person I'd like you to get married to. I don't care about who you're in love with. I can't stand who you're in love with. I want you to marry who we're in love with. I want you to now become a lawyer, a doctor. What, you want to be a dancer? A bohemian? Why don't you do something productive? What I'm just trying to do is to show you all kinds of examples, right? And by the way, I think it's not, by coincidence. Parents can actually be extremely demanding very often, and they can, on some level, even control the lives of their children. So how much do I have to actually let my parents control my life? Or at what point is it that I come along and say, you know what? My life is my life. Your life is your life. Live and let live. What I'm just trying to show you is that there are many, many possibilities of conflict. And then the question is, how do I resolve it? And what you'll find is in the example that I gave you where the rabbi said, right, observance of Shabbat takes precedence over honoring your parents. And by the same token, the rabbis in effect say, okay, that not only Shabbat, but any mitzvah, Observance of any mitzvah takes precedence over listening to your parents. So under no circumstances should I be listening to my parents and violate the Torah. But nevertheless, there still could be a way in which I can balance the two. It's still possible to say to my parents, look, these are values which I believe in very strongly. I respect you tremendously. I love you tremendously. Let's find a way where I can show you my love and at the same time not to have to compromise my principles. Is there a way to discuss it? Is there a way of showing your parents that you care about them even though you're not going to do every single thing that they want? That's a challenge. And that's the challenge of Kedoshim Tihiyu. And as I said, there are infinite demands that could be made on somebody, infinite situations where there could be conflict. And in any given situation, how do we resolve it? So I'm just raising the issues now, and I want to show you a number of different examples. So let's go a little bit further in the Parsha. Okay, if we look at verse 11, everybody see it starts out by saying, Lo tignovu, don't steal. And I would imagine everybody here, and I would certainly hope everybody here would say, well, of course, stealing. Who would even imagine to steal something? But how about all kinds of things which you don't necessarily relate to as stealing? And I'm going to take one example. The rabbis say that, we can talk about stealing of property, but we can also talk about stealing someone's mind. Now, for those of you who have a Tanakh, who have a Chumash, so I'll just refer you to a very interesting story, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And this is about Jacob. Jacob, who's by Lavan. And we all know that Lavan is a master at really deception, right? He tricks Jacob, gives him Leah instead of Rachel. Okay, so what I'm looking at right now is in the book of Breshit, in Genesis, in chapter 31. And chapter 31 essentially is where God appears to Jacob and says to Jacob, you know what, Jacob, the time has come for you to go back home to the land of Canaan, go back to your parents. And Jacob calls his wives and he says to them, in effect, he wants to get their agreement to go back. And they agree. Rachel says, of course we should be going back. Okay, we have nothing here. And for those of you who have this is chapter 31 in Breshit. And look at verse 20, 31:20. It says, Vayignov Yaakov et leiv Lavan ha'arami. Jacob stole the heart of Lavan. Al beli higidlo kivoreachu, because he didn't tell him he was running away. Because Jacob at that point didn't have we would say the guts to just go to Lavan and to tell him, right? In other words, God appeared to him and the time has come, right? In other words, he needs to be going back. He's afraid of Lavan. So he essentially runs away when Lavan is not around. And Lavan ends up chasing after him. And Lavan even says to him, okay, you stole my daughters, you stole my heart. Those are fighting words. Stole his heart. And on that basis, the rabbis say, yes, there's a concept of stealing someone's heart, deceiving them. So let's take the following scenario. You walk into a store and you're shopping around. and you go over to the person in the store and start asking them, pick anything you want, clothing, appliances, and you want to pump them for all kinds of information about what's the best thing that you could be buying, okay? And you just happen to go to a store which is overpriced. In your wildest dreams, you would never imagine actually buying the thing in the store because you always buy things over the internet. But why are you going to the store? Because you want to be able to actually see these things in real time, and you want to be able to find out all the information you possibly can so that later on you can go and buy it on the internet. This is called stealing somebody's mind. Because the person in the store is expecting that you might actually be buying this. Not only that, but it could be, and I've seen this in situations, where you get somebody who's a nudnik, who can actually take up a half an hour of the person's time, okay? Which means you're actually stealing their time and maybe even stealing the money because they could have made a sale with somebody else who actually really wants to buy. How about the flip side? You walk into the store and then this person starts telling you, oh, this piece of clothing looks so wonderful on you. And you know what? We're going to give it to you for a great price. It actually doesn't look so great on you. And it actually isn't such a great price. But they got to get rid of it. Okay? And they really pull a fast one on you and convince you this is really, by the way, I'm not even talking about the situations where you go into a store and people convince you to buy all kinds of things which you never really wanted to buy, right? In other words, here, you really wanted to buy this one thing, but you know what? We have the sale, 50% off on something else, and I got exactly what you could use for the second thing to buy. So what does it mean? It means that in effect, what we're doing is deception, stealing somebody's mind. That's stealing. Now, I already anticipate that there are going to be people who are going to tell me, yeah, but everybody does that. So does that make that right? And I'd even take one step further. Then what does that say about our society if everything that we do, all the interactions that we have, are all a lie, are all deceptive? Is that holy? What's wrong with trying to actually be upfront and honest? So I'm just trying to show you how here is this concept of Gnevat Da'at, which can have many, many ramifications. You go over to somebody, right, who's in your community, maybe even somebody who's very well connected, and you want to make an impression. You know that they're not going to be around this Shabbat. And then you say to them, how would you like to come to my house for Shabbat? Oh, we'd love to, but we won't be around the Shabbat. And then you keep on saying, oh, but we so much wanted you to come. And then, okay, I guess we're going to have a rain check. Okay, and of course you never cash in on the rain check. Or you always make sure to cash in when they're not going to be around because you know that they're not going to be around at a certain point. In other words, the idea being, how much do we try to make all kinds of impressions? In effect, if you think about it, what we're doing is we're actually manipulating people. We want them to think we're so wonderful and so loving and so giving, when actually we have an ulterior motive. So here I want to get into how much are we actually doing things thinking of somebody else, or how much are we doing things really because we have an ulterior motive? I'm going to jump for a second. If you look a few verses afterwards, okay, so let's go back to our Parsha, chapter 19 in Vayikra. Chapter 19, and we're going to look at verse, let me just find it. Verse 14. It says, Lo tekalel cheresh, don't curse somebody who's deaf. V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol. V'yareta me elokecha ani Hashem. Very important phrase. Don't curse somebody who's deaf. Don't place an obstacle before the blind. Now, this pasuk is fascinating. You know why? Because the rabbis did not interpret the pasuk literally, but they gave a whole bunch of different explanations that take this in a figurative sense. So now I just want to share the screen one more time and show you what we have. Let's just look at this for a second. Okay, everybody see me over here. Do not place an obstacle before the blind. One interpretation. Before one who is blind in the matter. If one comes to you for advice, don't give him advice which is inappropriate. Don't say to him, go out early in the morning in order that robbers should cut him down. Or go out in the afternoon in order that he faint from heat exhaustion. Don't say to him, sell your field and buy a mule, and then you circumvent him and take it from him. Perhaps you will say, I gave him good advice. Behold, the matter is given over to the heart, as it is said, and you should fear your God. I am Hashem. So let's first start with how the rabbis understand this. They understand the idea of someone who is blind as somebody who is blind in the matter, in the sense of being ignorant. You are the person who knows. They are the person who doesn't know. They are now turning to you for advice. How do you advise them? Do you advise them in terms of what's in their best interest? Or do you advise them in terms of what's in your best interest? Okay, by the way, I just want you to know, just to show you how this is actually very, very real. In my 43 years teaching in Pardes, I have had numerous situations of potential students who come to me and say, well, what do you think? Should we study in Pardes or should we go to some other place to go study? And there's always the question, right? Am I now, when I'm looking at them, thinking of what's in their best interest or what's in Pardes's best interest? Especially now with Corona, we could use as many people as we can to come to Pardes. So should we just try to get anybody that we can, right, and convince them this is the best place for them to be? Or at a certain point do we come along and think about what's really good for them? I'm sure you've all had the experience. And again, I come back to the example I gave where you go into a store and you ask them about different products, and then you might at a certain point come and say, well, what do you recommend? What do you think would be the best thing for me to get? Because there are so many choices. It's hard to choose. It's hard to know. So what do you think is the best thing? That person who's selling, how much are they really thinking about you when they're giving you that advice? Or how much is it they're thinking about what they need to unload in terms of their stock? You go to a lawyer. You want legal advice on how to do something. I had this a few years ago where there was a lawyer who said to me, I think that you should settle out of court. Now, the truth is, to this day, I don't know, what was motivating him, but I can tell you that by settling out of court, he made a lot of money on something without having to do that much. Had he gone to court, he would have still made some more money probably, but he would have had to work a lot harder. So was he doing this because he was really advising me and what was best for me? Or was he doing it because this is how he can make the most money with the least effort? We're always in those situations, everybody, where people will turn to us, and in some context, we might be the knowledgeable person. And how much are we always motivated by what's in the best interest of that person? Or to what extent is it that we might have an ulterior motive, and it might even be, in some cases, to actually undermine that person? Now, what's interesting in the Pasuk is it says at the end of the Pasuk, V'yareta me Elokecha ani Hashem. You should fear God, or your God, I am Hashem. And Rashi quotes a midrash, which is very interesting, which says, any matter which is given over to the heart, it says you should fear God. And what does that mean? So I am now going to misquote Abe Lincoln and say the following. You can fool some of the people all of the time, most of the people some of the time, and you could even fool yourself quite a few times, but you can never fool God. And what this pasuk is saying is, whenever you do something which is dependent on motivation, on your heart, and who can read your heart? Only God. Nobody can actually know what you're thinking at the time. How honest are you with yourself as to what's motivating in what you're doing? To put it in different language, how much is it that we do all kinds of things and then rationalize them and come up with all kinds of great explanations of why we did it and convince ourselves that, yes, this was the right thing to do and it was really good for that individual, where if deep down we were actually looking at ourselves carefully, we would recognize that, no, we were just being a scoundrel, right, in the eyes of God. By the way, placing an obstacle before the blind, you're selling something, or I shouldn't say, let's leave selling something. Okay, but okay, I'll just mention this because this actually, does become a big issue. There's actually a halacha based on this verse, which is you can't sell things to people which in the end actually might be used in a very problematic way. So let's take the following example. I sell cigarettes. People will then smoke. That can actually be very harmful to them. I sell alcohol, large quantities of alcohol, to people who maybe will not drink carefully, okay, in moderation. Sell drugs. How about selling weapons and don't necessarily exercise the proper care? Who am I selling the weapons to? How will they be used? What do I care about how they're going to use it? That's their issue. Okay? They're adults. What responsibility should I have? Well, maybe you do have a responsibility. Maybe you're actually enabling them to do something which is going to be harmful to themselves, harmful to others. You got to make a living somehow. Well, maybe find a different way to make a living. In other words, these are very, very serious questions. In other words, what do I do and how much am I impacting? To what extent am I thinking about what kind of society will result from my actions? Now let me show you something which is even trickier. The verse that I told you about putting an obstacle before the blind. So in the Talmud, and it's on my sheet, but I'm just gonna, because I like looking at everybody. So in the Talmud, they give the following example, right? And I'm sure this will even show you how complicated it is. A good friend of yours comes and they just lost their job because of the corona. They're really having a hard time. They could use a loan, interest-free loan. And thank God you happen to be well off and you can actually give it to them. Great. And you are very happy to do that. There's only one thing. Are you going to have them write it down? Are you going to make like a contract? Are you going to bring in witnesses who see that you're giving them the money? And then the person who wants to borrow the money, hey, Joe, you know me. How many years do we know each other? What, you don't trust me that I'm going to give you back the money? You want to make sure that I sign a paper, that we bring in witnesses? I am insulted. How could you show that lack of confidence in me? So according to the Talmud, anybody who lends money without witnesses is violating this law, putting an obstacle before the blind. Now here you come along and say, I don't get it. Here I am. I'm being a nice person. Not only am I being generous, but I'm showing how much I trust that individual. So why is that a problem? So Rashi says, because it might be human nature that, in other words, that if you don't have something written down and you don't have witnesses, then people might be tempted to then deny it. Which means that Harry, let's say for the moment, who borrowed the money from Joe, Harry, okay, is really a good guy. And he really would like to, give the money back. But for whatever reason, he used up the money. He has nothing to pay back. When Joe comes and says, hey, Harry, remember I gave you that loan? What loan? And he's not prepared to acknowledge that he took out a loan because he doesn't see how in any way he's going to be able to pay it back. Now that's Rashi's interpretation. But I want to say another thing, which I think, unfortunately, probably a few people may have had experiences with. That what happens if, Harry doesn't consciously deny it, but just forgot about it. And then Joe gets really upset, but I gave him that money. What happens when there's a misunderstanding about what the terms would be, about when it should be paid back? Okay, everybody I think has heard the expression, right? Never do business with friends. Or if you do business with friends, don't act like friends. Because in the end, if you act like friends, you probably will end up afterwards not being friends. Which means that if you really wanted to preserve your friendship, okay, for everybody's interest, it's important to write it down. What am I trying to show you with this? It shows how complex it is to interact with people, and how even sometimes when we have the best of intentions, it could actually boomerang and backfire. And it means people have to really think through and really examine what are the larger ramifications, implications of what I'm doing. I still have a few minutes, so let me just show you a few more examples. Okay, I love this Parsha. If you look in verse, let me just find it for a second. Verse 17. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Surely rebuke your fellow. V'lo tisa alav chet. And do not bear a sin on his behalf. Now, this verse is very interesting. So let's start with the first thing. The first thing is, don't hate somebody in your heart. Right? Now, let's take the following scenario. Somebody just hurt me in whatever manner, insulted me, okay, or did something else which really bothers me. So I try to be a nice guy. What does it mean I try to be a nice guy? Instead of just like, shouting at them and lashing out at them, so I just keep it in. So what this verse is saying is, don't hate somebody in your heart. Because if somebody did something to you and you keep it in and you don't respond to that, in the end, okay, and Rambam actually talks about this, in the end, it will actually explode. And so therefore, there's something which I think we recognize today, that it's actually important to be able to have a conversation. And therefore, this idea of rebuking somebody, which very often has a negative connotation, because we generally have this idea of you're being judgmental, okay? And you're like, who are you to tell somebody else something? But it actually, if you rebuke somebody the way it should be done, it's a way of being able to have a dialogue, to have a conversation, to be able to actually clear the air. And not only that, but even the word in modern Hebrew, lahochiach, which means to prove, may also have the idea of making something evident. And then the question becomes, if I really think somebody's doing something wrong, how do I actually bring it to their attention? Now, this has lots of ramifications on many different levels. And I think especially today, one of the biggest problems in America, and to a great extent in Israel also, is that people have lost the ability to actually argue, to rebuke in a civil way. And very often, if there's somebody who says something or does something which you find offensive, okay, either people will not react, or if they react, they'll react in a very belligerent way, which doesn't get anybody anything. It is not what God wants us to be doing. So the first thing which comes out, and this is one interpretation that the rabbis give to the end of the verse, if you rebuke someone, and you really believe they're doing something wrong, be careful how you do it. Because it could be in the act of rebuking, rather than rebuking them, you're going to be insulting them. Rather than bringing about something which is positive, you're actually going to be creating something which is much worse. And here the question is, when you rebuke something, why? Why are you doing this? What do you hope to gain by it? Ostensibly, what I hope to gain is that there should be a certain clarification, right, of what's going on. And then after the clarification, presumably, there should be, hopefully, improved behavior. So I'll tell you a story that I had many, many years ago. I lived in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. At the time, it wasn't so ultra-Orthodox, but it was mixed, called Har Nof. And there was this, I jokingly now call it the Saturday afternoon pastime, that originally Har Nof was supposed to be an open neighborhood. And so there were quite a few secular Jews who bought apartments there. And then with the passage of time, all of a sudden, it became kind of ultra-Orthodox, and the secular Jews found that, they were living in a neighborhood which they had never imagined when they bought their apartments. And there were some who were actually militant secular, and they wanted to make the point, right? Democracy, freedom of behavior. So they would purposely drive their cars through the neighborhood on Shabbat. So I want to just begin with that's not necessarily the way to go about making your point if you really want to be able to have a dialogue. But then there's the other side. The other side is, so the ultra-Orthodox population would, as soon as cars would drive through the neighborhood, gather together and start going, Shabbos, Shabbos, and then start looking mean and angry as if they were about to smash the car. Anyway, I had a neighbor who was a builder who actually built my apartment. And he said to me, he was very tempted, he never did this, but he was very tempted to ask one of his Arab workers to actually drive through the neighborhood on Shabbat. And these were the instructions: drive through the neighborhood on Shabbat, wait till a crowd gathers all around the car, wait till they start getting really agitated and start yelling and shouting. And as soon as you see that they're really in a frenzy, slam the brakes, get out of the car, go to the person who looks like they're the ringleader of the mob, and then say to them, excuse me, I didn't realize that it was Shabbat. Could you show me where the shul is? And he was convinced that if this guy, the worker, would do this, the ringleader would have a heart attack on the spot, because in his wildest dreams, he would never imagine that by yelling Shabbos at this car, all of a sudden they'd see the light and start keeping Shabbat. So what am I trying to get to with the story? If rebuking somebody is for the purpose of actually getting them to a better understanding, to changing their behavior, then maybe the way to do it is not to shout and not to be belligerent, but to actually find a way of engaging them in a conversation. And I would even add, and maybe sometimes you might find that maybe you interpreted things wrong. Maybe you didn't understand that person. Maybe you come to a new understanding. Maybe you come to a different perception. So the point being, the purpose of rebuking is in order to not only create a better reality, but to create a more amicable reality where we can understand each other better, where we can live with each other much better, and where we don't jump to conclusions, and where we don't become, okay, the scoundrel that Nachmanides is talking about. I'll just say this, and it's not just me, it's in the Talmud. It says that rebuking is probably the most difficult thing to do, both for the person who's doing the rebuking and the person who's receiving it. For the person who's receiving it, it's difficult because people don't like being criticized. For the people who are doing it, it's difficult because people have a tendency to be self-righteous across the board. Secular, Orthodox, doesn't matter. People like to always think they have the truth, whatever truth it is that they have. It takes unusual people to be able to actually be open enough to really think, maybe I don't understand the situation. Maybe let's talk about it. Maybe in this way, maybe let them understand me, let me understand them. And this way we'll actually come to a better result. By the way, I'll just point out, the best example in all of the Tanakh of rebuking is Bilam's donkey. For those of you who are familiar with the story, this is from the book of Numbers. Okay, Bilam is a non-Jewish prophet who is commissioned to go and curse the Jewish people. God doesn't want him to go, but he's pretty insistent. And then he goes on his way to go and curse the Jewish people. God says, okay, I'll let you go. But just remember, whatever I tell you is what you have to do. And then there's a certain point where as he's on his journey, there's an angel in front of him. And all of a sudden, the donkey sees the angel, but Bilam doesn't. So the donkey starts doing all kinds of strange things. So the donkey at one point tries to veer off the road. And then at another point, it also is veering off. And then finally, there's no place to go. So the donkey just sits down. And each time, Bilam hits the donkey. And then after the third time, all of a sudden, God opens up the mouth of the donkey. And what comes out? The donkey rebukes Bilam. And I'm just quoting this. So the donkey says, "What did I do to you that you have now hit me 3 times?" Now that's the perfect way of rebuking someone. Why? Because you're trying to get them to acknowledge that they did something which is wrong, which is in this case, hitting them. But you're not blaming them. You're not putting a value judgment on them. You're not even saying to them, why did you hit me? What you're saying is, what did I do that provoked it? Which means that you're now speaking in a way which in no way puts them on the defensive. And if anything, what it does is to open up a conversation. And by the way, Bilam's response is, you played around with me, hit alalpi, very, very strong language. Okay. He even says, if I had a sword, I'd kill you. By the way, I think that's actually very interesting also, that even though the donkey actually opened up a conversation, Bilam is not really interested in talking. Bilam's response in the end is, you know what? I want to end the conversation. I'd kill you. How do you rebuke somebody? By being open to saying, maybe I actually provoked you. Maybe it was my fault. Let's discuss it. I want to understand, okay? Everybody here can be honest with themselves. When was the last time that you saw somebody doing something that really irritated you, and then you said to them, excuse me, I see that you're really behaving in a very strange way. I must have done something to irritate you. Or how much is it that, in other words, when they do something to irritate you, you right away lash out? Everything which I've done today are all little things. Little things which in the end have big implications. And what I think the Torah is trying to show us is, if you want to have a holy society is not just what we would call today holy rollers, right? Who basically, sit and learn and daven and, and are really spiritual and everything else. And by the same token, having a holy society is also not by just throwing around all kinds of lofty slogans, democracy and freedom and everything else. Being a holy society is being able to take all of these big concepts and translate them in the day-to-day behavior, in the little things that we do, in the infinitely challenging number of situations that we find ourselves, and having to at every moment ask ourselves, how am I behaving? What would God want me to do in this situation? How am I able to overcome my knee-jerk reaction? How am I able to be honest with myself and really say to myself, is what I am about to do, is that going to better the situation or worsen it? Is what I'm about to do going to bring out the best of who I am and of the other person that I'm with? Or is it going to do the exact opposite? There isn't any one answer in any given situation, and that's what makes this so challenging. So I would say that what was true 3,000 years ago or more is true today. And this is the challenge of, how do we become a holy society? How do we know where we draw the limits, where we draw the lines? How do we know to always be not looking all the time at what is the other person doing and how to be always critical of the other person, but first and foremost to look at what we're doing and how to be challenging ourselves as how we could be the best people that we can, and in doing that, maybe educate the people around us. Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. And for the people who would like to stay, questions, comments, I'll be available for the next 20 to 30 minutes. And we will also, I think, unmute everybody who remains.
Thanks, Meir. I just want to say hello.
Chana, it's wonderful to see you. It's been many, many years.
It's been a long time, and it's been
You
wonderful.
haven't changed at all.
You neither. Thanks. Yeah. How are you all doing?
Baruch Hashem. Thank God.
Good.
We're doing well. Okay, but you should please be in touch with us. Are you still in New York?
I am. I'm in New York. Yeah. I'm in the thick of it. But thank God, doing okay.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So far so good. We're all careful. I'm careful, and I wear my mask, and what can I say? It's a very strange reality we all find ourselves in right now.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And in Israel as well, although in Israel, I think things are appreciably better than they are in New York.
Yeah, I think, I agree.
And I think that Israel is actually trying to begin now going back to what is generally called normal, at least Corona normal.
Right, so, right. Normal is different. For Israel, I think two things. It's a smaller country. It's easier to, to stop things. Okay. But they also started earlier.
Correct.
They started earlier, and that's key. That's really key. And, here, what can I say? I don't even want to get into it, but it is what it is.
But we have to make the best of the situations we find ourselves in.
Yes,
Yes,
and we
but
do.
it's wonderful to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you too. I'm really pleased. I actually usually go, I have another shiur that I go to at exactly this time with my current synagogue that I belong to. But today I figured, and I saw, I thought, oh, I would really love to go to see Meir and to see people. So today I just didn't go to that class, and I'm here with you, and it was a pleasure.
Okay, so Hannah, be in touch.
I shall. I think I still have your email, but I can get it. I can ask Pardes.
You can always get it.
Yeah, I can. I will be in touch. And please give my regards to Malka.
I certainly will. I certainly will. And she sends her best to you.
Thank you. Okay.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you. Okay, I'm going to stand back now.
Okay.
Because there are other people.
Okay, anyone else? I see there were a whole bunch of comments during this year. Okay, so if there's anybody who would like to say anything publicly, that's your call. Okay, I see everybody's quiet here. Everyone is still muted. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, who am I talking to?
I have a question. Mayor?
Yes.
When is it better? When is it better? All right. When is it better not to give rebuke for someone transgressing halakha? Because if you would give them musar, then they may not agree with what you're saying, or they may not do it. So it's better, like a tinok shenishba, better not to know that they're violating something than to violate something with knowledge.
I would say that, in other words, if you're not going to be able to do it in a way which is going to be heard, which is essentially what the Talmud says, then don't bother doing it.
What if you don't know? It's possible they would take what you have to say into consideration.
So then that, again, that is something that you have to be able to gauge in the particular situation, and you have to really ask yourself, who is the person? What's the context? Okay, to what extent will they be actually open to hearing things that I say? Okay. By the way, sometimes you might be saying, hey, there's something interesting I just learned today. How would you like to? I'd like to share it with you. Could be. I mean, but that's it. I think that's part of the point that I was saying, that I don't think there's necessarily a set answer. I think in any given, a lot of it depends on the dynamics between the people. And I think it means that you have to be very, very sensitive to the dynamics, right? The nature of the relationship, right? It could be that people that you have a relationship will be much more receptive to things that you have to say. People who are coming off the street, like, who are you to all of a sudden start telling me certain things?
But this is
and I would also say in some cases, it might also be the people that you might be closest to, sometimes might be the hardest to say things to.
Then looking at another level is, when does a teacher or Rav take that into consideration when they give a Devar Torah, that maybe they're going to say something where the person can say, oh, really? Well, I do that anyway. I guess now I'm more of an Avera because I'm doing it with knowledge that it specifically is forbidden.
Yeah, that issue used to come up in Pardes a lot. There was actually one teacher that we had in Pardes who taught halakha, okay, who actually used to always say to himself, what am I doing over here? Because now I'm getting people to actually, consciously violate halakha, because now they know what they're doing wrong, okay? But I think he said that joking around. But look, Mark, I'm a big believer in education. Right. And I have to say that, in other words, in terms of being in Pardes, my attitude has always been that, knowing the clientele and knowing who the people are, my expectation isn't that people are going to, dramatically change in all kinds of things, but I just present it, and who knows, and let people be able to then take it wherever they want to take it. But I'm a big believer of that.
Toda rabah. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Anyone else? Tziona, hi.
Thank you for the shiur. So I want to ask you something. Like when I go to the movies, it always happens, almost always. There are some bright sparks or kids or someone who's talking. Of course, the movie's in English, and they're really making a noise and creating a balagan or talking, and it's really driving me mad. And I try to say something nicely, but often I'm just so angry that it comes out not so nice. And them being Israelis, they're using their cell phones, and oh my gosh. And it's so hard to try and do it in a way, I don't know.
Tziona, you're proving my point. Yes, it is very, very hard. And you know what? There have been situations, right? I think somebody once told me of a story where they went on a bus and there was this, teenager, right, who put his feet on the seat that was opposite them, right? So that, first of all, somebody can't sit down over there. And second of all, even if they do sit down, so they just got it nice and dirty, okay? And then someone came over and said to them, "Excuse me, could you put your feet down?" And the kid doesn't react, then says it a second time. And then the third time that he says it, the kid spits in his face. So what do you do? What do you do? Now, as somebody who has a tendency, right, Tziona, to also get very agitated and passionate about seeing something, there's a certain point where I think, you have to say to yourself that, what am I going to gain by just getting angry? And it's just going to end up bringing out the worst in me. And it might actually lead to something that could be, how should I put it, violent interaction. Now, in some cases, it could be, which on an Israeli bus might happen, where you could say to the bus driver, and the bus driver might say something to the kid. Okay, but you're right. There may be certain situations where you can try. You can say, shh, slicha. But, I think there may come a certain point, and that's what makes all these laws very challenging. Where as much as you try to do it in a nice way, they just won't react that way. Now, in an ideal situation, right? I'm giving you, this is like, it would never happen. But in an ideal situation, you would say to the person, "Excuse me," right? In other words, I really want to be able to hear this, and I can't hear it. You're right. Could you please, maybe you can, do something else just so that we could hear it. And at a certain point, if they just laugh at you and don't react, worse, they laugh at you. So then at a certain point you say, okay, they're teenagers. What do you expect? Okay. But the idea being, you said what you thought and you made your point. Okay. Maybe it'll register somewhere, maybe not. But the alternative would be to then get into a big fight, which in the end, I don't think is where you want it to go, or where anybody would want it to go. And that's hard. That's very, very hard. It's very, very hard. And here again, in Israel, they used to have a very interesting commercial, which was, it was actually talking about, driving in Israel. So, you come to an intersection and then you see somebody who's cutting in. And then you say, "I'm not going to let them do that because I have the right of way." So you cut in ahead of them. And then inevitably you might have a crash. So then what they said in the commercial is al tiyeh chacham, al tiyeh tzodek, tiyeh chacham. Don't be right, be smart. Which means, unfortunately, there are many situations where, yes, I am right, but the fact of the matter is, where does that get me? And sometimes the best thing is that I have to also realize that being right isn't enough. that I also have to be smart, and then the question is, what ultimately is my goal, and how am I going to get there? And again, I would say that what's very, very difficult is that, I said in the shir that it's much easier to deal with God than it is with people, simply because I think God is much more reasonable. I think people tend to very often be obnoxious. So you could be, really nice, and you could be reasonable and everything else, but the person that you're dealing with isn't. And then at what point is it that, in other words, because of that, you become like them? Or at what point is it that you say to yourself that no matter what, I have to always be able to hold on to what I think I should be? And that's hard. That's very hard. I'm still learning that. Anyone else? Yes, Angela?
Yeah, thank you. With the posuk, thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart.
Correct.
Does that mean then that you should say to that person, you're upsetting me, or I feel angry because you such and such, or should you just not? Should you just try and root out hatred of people in your heart? Does it mean you have to express it or not?
Okay, so according to the pasuk, so this is how the rabbis understand the relationship between the two parts. Knows it's saying, don't hate someone in your heart, rather rebuke them, which means that from the rabbinic perspective, if somebody's hurt you, then it's extremely important for you to be able to then, discuss that. And it could very well be that, in other words, they've done something which is problematic. And so that even if you're willing to quote unquote, I don't want to make it sound, even if you're willing to forgive them and you really forgive them, but it might be that by forgiving them, you're just going to be reinforcing very, very negative behavior. So that, in other words, yes, you'll forgive them, but then the next time they'll do the same thing to someone else. And the next time it could be even really problematic in terms of, the results of what they're doing to somebody else. So therefore, the ideal is that this is something that you have to bring up and should be discussed in order to correct that behavior. Now, the part of which I also tried to say was that there's some times, and I found this in my experience, which I think is actually very interesting. There are times when I may say something in a class and somebody actually was very upset about what I said. And then it turns out that they actually read into what I said something that I never said or never meant. And so to what extent is it that someone got very offended, but maybe the person didn't actually offend you? Maybe like you're reading into something which they did much more than is there. And so I think this is part of, rebuking, to just clarify what exactly happened right now, because it could be that maybe you actually really are taking it the wrong way. Now, the flip side is, but it could also be that they very much were doing something offensive. And now the question is, and how are they going to realize that? And even if, for example, somebody said, oh, I was just joking, right? I didn't mean that. But the fact of the matter is, but even if they were joking, and even if, all things being equal, okay, it was a joke. But it could be that you're somebody who's very sensitive, and then they should also realize that before they start joking around, that maybe they have to be careful who they're saying whatever they're saying to, because they might actually be very hurt by something. So I'm just saying that the whole idea is to be able to clear the air and essentially to make sure that there isn't any misunderstanding, to make sure there isn't any bad feelings, and that we end up right with everybody doing what should be. Now, if it should turn out that you think this is a person I just can't talk to for whatever reason, because you've tried in the past and they just don't listen, then the question would be, to what extent is it that you're capable of actually saying, you know what, I just won't hold it against them. That's the way they are, and let me leave it. But I think that's actually not such an easy thing to do. And by the way, in the Talmud, based on on a certain story that we find in the Tanakh, Amnon and Tamar, the Talmud actually sees it, and that's what Maimonides refers to when I said that if people keep it in, at a certain point it builds up. And it could very well be that, in other words, okay, so I'm not reacting, but all that you need is some other type of situation that's going to trigger it, and then you might explode, which means that the next time that person might do something else, and then all of a sudden you will overreact the next time because there's this baggage which is sitting with you. So that's why I say I think it's very, very difficult, and especially when people feel that they've been hurt. How are you able to somehow express that in a way which is going to convey that feeling of being hurt, and at the same time actually bring about a positive result? And as I said in the shir, the rabbis see this idea of rebuking, and goes back to Tziona, as being probably the most difficult thing that, challenging thing that we have. Because by the way, I would say this, and I think we see it today also. It's very, very hard for people to really talk about things, right? Where there's this feeling of us and them. I mean, in America, people have a hard time now talking about politics. Either you're for Trump or you're against Trump, and everybody all of a sudden starts labeling the other side and shouting, and to the point where people stop talking to each other. And that's a very, very problematic situation. And so the question is, how do we prevent that, and how do we stop that, and how are we able to somehow try to bridge the gap rather than widen it?
Thank you. I mean, I would just add to that for those of us brought up in this country, in Britain, it's extra difficult because we're brought up to not make trouble and not just keep quiet. Don't make things worse. Don't make things worse. You might make things worse. Just you'll forget about it in time. That's how most of us were brought up. So it's very, very difficult.
And I would say, in other words, and maybe that's maybe that's a problem in terms of the social fabric. In other words, that maybe we should be able to have a social fabric where people are able to actually speak, but to speak in a very civil way, and that we can actually articulate these things and not where we can be critical, and I will use the language, I might sound funny, but we can be critical and loving at the same time.
Yeah.
And the question, I think, and especially, is how much do we have a sense of a shared existence? And maybe that's also part of the problem, that what is it that we really share in common with that other person, which can then give us this basis for dialogue. So I think the assumption over here is, as the Jewish people, that we should see that, in other words, the fact that we're all Jews is something very powerful that we should now be sharing together. It's like a family, right? In other words, in theory at least, right? In other words, a family is something which you have and which you will always have and you should have. And as a result of that, in other words, no matter what, right, we're still a family. And so therefore we have to find a way of somehow, and how much do we really see ourselves in that light? And the more that we see it, then maybe the more we're motivated to try to find some sort of, like I said, amicable solution. Or what I think maybe is more prevalent today, the fact that there's such mobility on many different levels, right? In terms of, divorce, in terms of just moving to another country and everything else. So therefore people don't necessarily feel that sense. So I'm really in it together with whoever else it is. And if there's a problem, so then the simple solution is, so let's just, part ways.